1976, over 40 years ago, elite passengers were crossing the Atlantic in under 3.5 hours, flying at twice the speed of sound in the Anglo-French Concorde. Only 20 of the sleek Delta-winged SSTs were built, and just 14 were delivered to two airlines, 7 each to Air France and British Airways. With superlative service and cuisine, exclusive airport lounges, and stratospherically high airfares, Concorde passengers flew far above other flights and cruised faster than fighter jets to their destinations. Concorde's last commercial flight landed 15 years ago on October 24, 2003. We had supersonic travel within our grasp between the 70s all the way up to the 21st century. Why has it become a relic of the past and a symbol of what could have been the desired method of air travel? The Concorde, an engineering marvel and aviation icon, was a triumphant display of 1960s French/British relations and demonstrated the capability to fly supersonic in an optimistic aviation sector striving to connect people in short amounts of time. However, throughout the years up till its retirement in 2003, the Concorde was tragically not economically viable, environmentally sound, and the advent of wide-bodied aircraft made the aviation industry turn towards profit over speed. The 1960s was a decade marked by relentless optimism for the future. Laser beam satellites and moon landings, this was a decade in which the world was changing quickly. In just a few short years, propeller-driven aircraft had been replaced by sleek new jetliners. While this new jet age was exciting, many were expecting an even bigger leap forward. Air travel was about to get a whole lot faster. Starting in the 1950s, a propeller-driven airliners could take 15 hours to fly from New York to London. In the 1960s, a jet made that same flight in around 7 hours, but many were expecting that by the 1970s, supersonic transports would begin replacing jets, and they would fly 2 or even 3 times the speed of jetliners, and that would cut a New York to London flight down to under 3 hours. By the end of the 1970s, hundreds of these supersonic transports were expected to be flying.
Like a piece of modern sculpture, a supersonic airliner which should be airborne by 1970. An Anglo-French project, her name is Concorde. And Concorde was the keynote in London when Britain's Minister of Aviation, Mr. Julian Amery, and France's ambassador to Britain signed a joint agreement for her development and production.
On November 29, 1962, Britain and France signed a treaty to share costs and risks in producing a supersonic transport. The orders came in very early, the aviation industry was very excited, and supersonic flight was in its early days. It was thrilling. Concorde was the way forward. Airlines across the world responded with great excitement, 16 airlines ordering some 75 aircraft. Many of the orders were from airlines from the US, which infuriated Kennedy. The Americans were worried that their own airlines would be flying a foreign plane, not American planes, which fueled their desire for supersonic transports. However, by the time the Concorde entered commercial service in 1976-77, everyone in the world knew it would not be profitable, and the only commercial applications for the Concorde were the national airlines of France and England. As impressive as it may be, it is just a plane resembling the ambition of dominating the market of an absurd proxy war between countries that they both can make better, faster, and bigger aircraft. Also, the planes were supposed to be put into service in 1973. But this was the time of the great oil crisis, fuel costs rocketed, and more than that, it was also the time when environmental lobbyists became vocal.
We dread one flight over our heads. If the French and the British made a mistake with this plane, we're sorry for them.
Concorde was made in the optimistic times of the 60s, but just came into the market at the wrong time. As a result, the original 16 airline orders for the Concorde had all been dropped, as there was no profit to be made. Air France and British Airways had to fly the Concorde as the airlines are government regulated, and they had to use so much money for development and research to the point where it would be an embarrassment to not fly it. The Concorde became the most overall successful venture into the supersonic transports. Its competition, the Soviet Union's Tupolev Tu-144 and America's Boeing 2707, could not even come close to the Concorde's resume, even though all governments had poured in hundreds of millions of dollars into the developments per aircraft. The Tu-144 was basically a flawed, rushed carbon copy of the Concorde. Even though the Tu-144 beat Concorde to the skies twice with its maiden flight and its first supersonic flight 2 months before Concorde, it was a commercial blunder due to design flaws, and economically there was no real need for high passenger transportation over sparsely populated areas. Public opinion surrounding the Tu-144 had essentially faltered in the world's eyes as a result to a 1973 Paris Airshow incident where the plane broke up in midair, proving Concorde's dominance and reliability. With the Americans, their own version of a supersonic transport, the Boeing 2707, developed in the mid-60s, never came off the ground because of lack of funding from the federal government. The overall project was disliked by the public due to ensuing issue of sonic booms and effects on the ozone layer. The American government canceled its supersonic transport project in 1971 after having spent more than $1 billion. Concorde was a clear winner as it had been the only aircraft to actually be implemented into commercial service and reliable enough to fly for 34 years. Also, Concorde became the symbol of wealth and money. If you were able to partake in this 3.5-hour flight jumping the pond, then you were part of the elite, the 1%, whatever it may be. It was an experience to remember.
When I'm doing it every week, I truly can just regard it as commuting to work. Speed is what it's all about for me, the ability to avoid these overnight flights, get to the other end fresh. And that's what this great plane does.
The next category were your film stars, celebrities, pop musicians, and the whole atmosphere on the airplane was completely different from the atmosphere you'd get on a subsonic airplane. All these guys, they were constantly flying across the Atlantic on Concorde, and they all knew each other, and it was a sort of sociable event.
From an airline marketing standpoint, aircraft such as the Concorde have always been passenger favorites. From a business market view, however, which is the airline's bread and butter revenue, frequencies of operation and schedule convenience have always won out over a carrier, which may offer one daily supersonic flight to a particular destination, especially with the high cost and only a limited amount of destinations. The plane itself could not fly to many places due to its massive supersonic booms, specifically in the United States. In 1964, years before the first test flight of Concorde, the U.S. Air Force and FAA ran a test of sonic booms over Oklahoma City, and residents reported hundreds of damaged windows and noise disturbances. As a result, in 1973, the FAA issued 14 CFR Part 91.817, regulation that prohibited flight over Mach 1 over the United States or a certain distance from U.S. shores. Any chance of flying lucrative U.S. transcontinental routes were locked out, thus impacting the sales potential of the Concorde and the viability of any future supersonic transport. Even though the Supreme Court intervened and lifted parts of the ban, it meant that the aircraft can only fly to certain airports such as New York or Washington. Even then, a massive fleet of supersonic planes would have probably caused real damage, setting red flags for a supersonic future. An anti-SST movement had grown from a handful of concerned citizens to a major national coalition of environmental organizations. Growing public opposition to sonic booms had spread to other kinds of other fears. Some worried that hundreds of supersonic airliners flying at a high altitude would emit enough nitrogen oxide to destroy the ozone layer. They painted a picture of a dystopian future where exhaust gases and water vapor would cover the earth in a permanent haze. Thus, before Concorde could even take flight, these ideas of the plane remained stagnant throughout the years into the 80s. Also, fuel requirements limited range of transatlantic journeys without any trans-Pacific cash cows. It guzzles so much fuel that price fluctuations could hit particularly hard. With ticket prices as high as $12,000, that was a significant risk. Ticket prices had to be expensive because at most, only 120 passengers could have been put on the plane. The price tag couldn't be distributed, which is compounded by the need for specially qualified crew members and maintenance, which is all for a very demanding crowd.
And British Airways had to position a spare Concorde in New York in case the flight back had problems. So there's an airplane sitting on the ground not making any money just in case, because Concorde passengers expect, to walk onto a Concorde because they paid a lot of money to it.
With that in mind, it was more economically viable for the airline industry to use bigger, slower, wide-bodied aircraft that are designed to have a combination of efficiency and passenger comfort over the Concorde, especially being able to spread the price tag per seat over 300 to 450 passengers, depending on the type of plane. The wide-body aircraft of the time, such as the Boeing 747 or the DC-10, were more effective and accurate designs to what the true market needed, which was not how fast one can get to their destination, but how many can we get to their destination. With the environmental issues revolving around sonic booms and ozone layers, economics, and the aviation industry's favoritism of profit over speed, it slowly started to add up onto Concorde between the 70s to the late 90s.
I don't think it'll ever get off the ground.
On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 crashed nearby Genoese, killing 109 people on board. The official French crash report concluded that there were vulnerabilities to Concorde's fuel tanks and tires, which meant that Air France and British Airways grounded their aircraft until November 2001. But at that point, the world moved on. New York's Twin Towers had devastated the aviation industry. Air travel lost its appeal and demand for business flights, which meant that the Concorde was finally put in its tombstone.
It was just dreadful.